Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about job hunting, starting and running a business, and building wealth, the whole financial side of life. And I'm probably smiling a little bit more broadly today than normal, and that's because I quite literally just got finished appearing on the show of a new friend of mine, a young fellow by the name of Daryl Jackson, who was based in, I believe it's Maryland, Pikesville, Maryland. Darren just launched his show today. I was his inaugural guest. I'm very pleased to have been asked by Daryl to help him launch his show. And it's called Jordan's Crossings, for, of course, Daryl Jordan, and it was like any new show. And those of you who have been around the Way to Wow shows from the beginning, there's always technical glitches, and you work through them, and Daryl did, and we got the show going, and we had a really wonderful conversation. So I recommend to you check out. I'm sorry, I said Jordan, Daryl Jackson, Jackson's Crossing. So go on LinkedIn and check out what Daryl is doing at Jackson's Crossing. And I think you will find a young man with a lot of experience and a lot of knowledge and a lot of enthusiasm for his work and his desire to help other people. So I had to jump off his show and come onto my own. But Daryl, if you happen to catch this show, thanks so much for having me as a guest. It was really a pleasure speaking with you. It ended up being kind of a far-ranging discussion. We started out talking about trusts and estates, which is the area in which both Daryl and I have our primary practice, but we ended up talking about media and some of the old and new personalities in the entertainment business. And so really just a wonderful conversation. So today, our topic is the business paradox. So if you are in business or are considering getting into business with family members, so you'll have a sense of that about which I'm speaking. And I will preface this by saying that I come at this topic from personal experience. So when I had my real estate services company here in Los Angeles before I joined the Navy, at one time I had my mother working for me, and my father working for me, and my older sister working for me, and my younger sister working for me. In fact, that was the entirety of my immediate family. Now, you may say, well, that's not particularly unusual. Well, it was a little bit unusual because at that point, both my parents had been divorced for over 10 years, I think 15, maybe close to 20 years at that point. And to their credit, they worked very well together. Both of them working for their son's company, it wasn't without conflict, to be honest. And while we did our best to get along professionally, it's a very hard situation when there's family history, there's emotions, there's you know uh, uh, things that you remember from, in my case and my sisters, from when we were children that are now coming to the fore, all these kind of things. So there is an additional layer of challenge that comes when a business it has multiple family members in it that are certainly different, if not actually unique, from a business where it's not family members involved. And so I wanted to talk about those today because I think, there are first of all, for those of you who are regular watchers of the show, so I think that I am a big believer in people starting and running their own businesses. Uh, Nothing wrong with working for another company. However, to have your own business, to be sort of the master of your own professional and financial fate to a much larger degree than when one is an employee, I think is an important opportunity for people who are serious about professional success to consider. And beyond the financial and professional sphere, it gives us an opportunity for personal growth that is different and I think broader than that which we can experience as an employee. So and so the idea of starting a business with family members, I think, is very attractive. Hopefully, we have the kind of relationships with our family members that we want them to be a part of our success. That was part of the motivation I had in bringing my family members into my business. So, I also felt a responsibility to see to it that they had the ability to, support themselves. Not my parents; they were actually kind of came out of retirement to work with me. But for my sisters, I felt like I had gained a certain level of success, and so having them work for me meant that I could, in a way, sort of give them something that give them some security of employment, if you will, that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have had, at least at that time in their life. So there's lots of, I think, good reasons to go into business with your family members, but there are challenges and problems that come with that. And so I'm going to be focusing on those challenges because I know for myself, when I brought my family members into the business, I was only looking at the upside of working with my family members. I did not consider the downside or the challenges that I would face. And I think if I had considered that, I wouldn't have changed what I did, but I would have handled things differently and perhaps more successfully if I had had the information that I'm going to convey to you on this show. So I came up with, I believe it's eight issues to discuss with you on this subject, and I'm just going to jump right into them. So the sort of unspoken challenges, right, of running a family-owned business. Number one, there are blurred boundaries between personal and professional relationships. It is unavoidable. As much as we would try to bifurcate those relationships and say, while we're in the office or in the workplace, this is a purely professional relationship. All issues of family and personal matters are left outside the door when we come into work. As a practical matter, that doesn't happen. Personal issues encroach on professional issues. They just do. We None of us can so separate the parts of ourselves so effectively that we can leave the personal issues behind. Well, and I shouldn't say none of us. I suppose there are people out there who can do it, but I would argue that that's not a healthy thing. That people could so make a separation and would think that it's a good idea to interact with their family members with no regard for the familial relationships. I don't think that's a wise way of handling matters in a family owned, family run business. So inevitably the family dynamics will spill over, and I think the recognition of that is important, so that so that the various family members can be prepared for when that happens and can deal with the blurred boundaries between personal and professional relationships as effectively as possible. Okay, rather than trying to create this absolute barrier between the two, which probably is not going to work, better to understand that there will be these sort of crossovers, at least from time to time, and have a sense, a plan for how such crossovers will be handled. So, for example, family members may disagree about business strategy or the launching of a new product or a new service, and and just like anytime there is a disagreement in a business, the resolution of that conflict can sometimes be difficult. All the more so when the resolution of that conflict or the attempts to resolve it bring up sort of old familial issues. So you can imagine between siblings. Well, you always got your way when we were kids, right? Can you imagine? I mean, look, I can imagine someone saying that, in a business situation where they're just so frustrated about a discussion over business strategy, and they feel like, once again, now I'm an adult, but I still don't get my way, right? Very, very frustrating. And so dealing with that up front, I think, is important. Having these kinds of discussions up front is important. Being clear about where decision making authority lies is critically important to successfully navigating those kinds of problems. Now, again, using myself as an example. So I had two sisters, an older and a younger sister. I'm in the middle, but I'm the only boy. Okay. The only boy in a Jewish family. Right. So, if you've ever heard this term, I was the Jewish American prince. Okay. Now, my sisters were Jewish American princesses, but there were two of them. Right. And so somehow, and I never felt this as a kid growing up, but my sister generally felt that somehow, my parents were easier on me than they were on them. And we've talked about it over the years. And I mean, intellectually, I can understand what they're saying to me, but I don't feel it, because I don't feel like I lived some sort of, easy life relative to my sisters. Quite to the contrary, I think sometimes I know sometimes my dad was much tougher on me than he was on my sisters. And he said so. He told me at times, like, you're the boy. If something happens between you and your sisters, it's your fault. Right. So these are the kinds of things, though, that can come out in a business discussion that becomes heated, and they need to be dealt with candidly, professionally, right? But the idea that somehow these aren't going on, at least in the background, it would be foolish of family members working in the same business to think that these things aren't going on in the background. And so in the end, it's a better plan to sort of, identify the elephant in the room, so to speak, and deal with them up front. Now, that doesn't mean that they need to be dealt with the non-familial, members of the company present. It may be that there needs to be a closed door meeting with just the family members to deal with these issues and not put them on display among the other people working there. That may be the best strategy. On the other hand, one has to be careful too that the non-family members of a company don't feel that somehow they're being excluded, and the family members just get together and they make all the decisions, and that's how things get worked out. So again, these are complex issues, and there needs to be a lot of thought, a lot of carefully considered communication, and I think candor between the family members and between the non-family members. There needs to be candor with, but not the kind of candor where it's used as a club to beat somebody up, but the kind of candor of, you, you know, there are some familial issues here, and like if I were in a meeting where with family members and non-family members, and things started to get heated, and my instinct was, this is not coming from a business place, this is coming from a family place. My inclination, especially if I were, kind of leading the meeting, would be to say, hey, I think there's some family issues going on here. If I can just have this person, this person, this person, in other words, the family members stay for a few minutes. Everybody else, why don't you take a break for 15 or 20 minutes? We need to deal with these family issues, and then we can come back to the substance of this meeting. That's the kind of candor I'm talking about. And then the family members can talk through whatever the problem is, or whatever sort of emotional strings are being tugged. And then the meeting can reconvene, and it can continue on in a more productive way. Okay, so the blurred boundaries between personal and professional relationships, that's definitely a challenge in family-owned businesses, but it should be dealt with up front. So that's number one. Number two, succession planning paralysis and legacy pressure. So I mentioned that I was just on Daryl Jackson's show before coming onto my own, and Daryl was telling a story about how his great grandfather was a lawyer, and his grandfather took over the legal business from Daryl's great grandfather. And although his mother was not a lawyer, the expectation was that he would be third generation lawyer. And Daryl used, I mean, I laughed out loud. One of the funniest lines I've ever heard, he said, instead of being third generation lawyer, I was first generation disappointment. Right. And I mean, I get it. Right. There's a lot of pressure. Family members, parents, grandparents sometimes put a lot of pressure on younger generations. You've got to take over the family business, or you've got to join the family business, or you have to make the family business your life the way it was mine. Those kinds of things, it's a level of pressure that you don't have among non-family members. And so dealing with the succession planning and the pressure to keep a legacy going can be very different. It can be very difficult. The flip side of that is that sometimes family business owners delay succession planning because it forces everybody to deal with the mortality, or the potential mortality of hopefully a beloved family member, and the idea of relinquishing control of one's life work, even to younger generations, can be a daunting prospect for family members. An admission that younger generations are coming to the fore, and older generations are reaching the time when they need to step off the stage, so to speak. So I think that's enough. That's one problem. The sort of emotional weight that is put on family members to be a part of a business, or the emotional weight that's put on a family member when that family member is excluded from the business, whereas all the other family members get to be a part of it. That's a sort of a reverse legacy pressure. Like, you can't be a part of the legacy of this family firm. Think of how that can redound on people, on family members, and what that could do to the dynamics of family members, right? So these are all part of succession planning and creating a legacy, and it can be very difficult for the family members to deal with this on their own. And they may be very well advised to bring in what amounts to a neutral third party, someone who's not a member of the family, who can facilitate candid discussions among the family members and mediate some of these issues so that a proper succession plan can be developed and put in place, one that is as free as possible from the pressures of legacy, so that a family member isn't pulled into a business when they really don't want to be a part of it, or it's not appropriate for whatever reason for them to be a part of it, and so that people aren't potentially excluded who might want to and really can make a substantial contribution to that business. So succession planning, paralysis, and legacy pressures, that's another aspect of the unspoken challenges of running a family business. Okay. Number 3, compensation, dilemmas over compensation and equity. So, determining what is proper compensation for family members can become complicated when 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 issues such as a particular family member's contribution to the business, another family member's needs are taken into account, what the ownership stakes are, what the family hierarchy is. So my business that I mentioned at the beginning of the show, where I had started the business and then brought my parents into the business, that's kind of unusual, right? Usually parents bring their children into a family business, not vice versa. And so it's why I salute my parents, because the hierarchy was kind of set on its head. My dad was he was the father of the family, right? And yet he really loved working with me in my business, and was part of it was because I think I was able to create a role for him doing what he really loved to do. My dad loved working with tools. He loved fixing things. He was the quintessential engineer. Although in his engineering career, he was most of his career he was involved in quality assurance. So he wasn't really involved in the building of the various devices, satellites, et cetera, that the firms he worked for created. So then to have an opportunity to, with his toolbox, to go out to these buildings, all the buildings were his own sort of personal, tinker toy sets in that respect, and meeting with the tenants and talking with them. I realized my dad was a much more personable and likable guy than I ever knew as a kid growing up, right? So I learned new aspects of really both my parents through having them work for me. And fortunately, there was no issue of this reversed family hierarchy. But you can imagine that there could be. It doesn't. In fact, it doesn't take really any imagination to realize that there can be. There could be. And look, I mean, I had other people working for me at the same time as family members. And the fact of the matter is, my family members got treated better. Now, in retrospect, that probably wasn't the best way for me to handle things, but I felt an obligation to my family members that I didn't feel to my non-family members. And so, they got paid better. And, if they didn't show up, I just sort of, okay, they didn't show up. They obviously had something important to do. They had more flexibility in that respect than my, non-family members did. And so, the dilemmas that this creates can be a problem. Now, I was fortunate. The non-family members that I, with whom I worked, they understood the dynamic, and they were, at the times when they felt that the unequal treatment was not acceptable, they came to me and said so. And I salute them for, again, their candor. They didn't do it with rancor. They just said, "Hey, come on, man, I'm making a contribution here, and I think it needs to be recognized, with equal, appropriateness." So, among the family members, though, sometimes you'll have a family member who really just doesn't have the abilities, the skills, the knowledge, the experience, and yet, they're paid the same amount as a family member who is much more skilled, experienced, and knowledgeable, right? So, is that the right way to handle things? Well, I mean, parents may, the parents, if they were the founders of the business, they may feel compelled to treat all their children equally with respect to compensation and equity in the business. But the children might resent the fact that, one of them is making a far lesser contribution to the business and yet is getting the same compensation package. That won't seem fair to them. And so, how do you deal with these issues, right? Again, within the context of the family. So, when we have non-family members in the business, I think it's much easier to be objective about compensation and potential equity, et cetera, based on what the person brings to the business, the value they bring to the business. But it gets cloudy when family members are involved. And so, that's where conflict can arise among the family members and between the family members and the non-family members. So, whether it's profit distributions, whether it's time off, whether it's job titles, authority, every single aspect of the employment situation is potentially on trial. I use that word advisedly, um, is on review by family members, through the lens of what of the experience they've had with family life, over the prior years. Okay, let's take a break. When life brings unexpected changes, managing inherited property shouldn't add to your stress. Magnum Properties specializes in probate and trust real estate management. We handle the complexities while you focus on what matters most. From property maintenance to tenant relations, from legal compliance to maximizing value, we're your trusted partner through every step. Magnum Properties, Inc., turning property challenges into peace of mind. Call us today at 213-264-4396 or visit magnumprops.com. So, this is People Making Money. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm talking about the challenges, especially the unspoken challenges of running a family-owned business. I talked about 3 before the break: the blurred boundaries between personal and professional relationships, the challenges of succession planning and legacy preservation, and then the dilemmas surrounding compensation and equity. So, another challenge of running a family-owned business is that sometimes it can be difficult to attract and retain top non-family talent. Now, I've mentioned some of the potential conflicts that can arise between the family and the non-family members in a company. They all play into this. So, there are people who they just won't consider working for a family run business because they recognize that they're always going to be an outsider in some way. Okay. And so, that can translate in many different ways. First of all, it can mean that there's limited opportunity for advancement, i.e., they're never going to be the one running the firm because the most senior person in the company is always going to be a family member. It's going to pass from generation to generation. So that can be a stumbling block for someone who who part of their professional plan is to, be the person at the top of the management structure. It can also be that they know they're just never going to be able to get certain key positions, even though it's not the top position, or that that and that regardless of merit, family members are going to have these roles. So that's number one. I think number two, there is a concern that maintenance of the family may take precedence over other decisions that may be better for the firm, right? So the upside potential of the business may be limited by the desire of the family to keep its members working in the firm, and especially if the knowledge, skills, and experience of those family members isn't top notch, and therefore the firm won't be as successful as it might otherwise be. Okay, so for a non-family member going in, that can be a deterrent to their wanting to be part of that firm, right? So as a result, the business may suffer from a lack of perspective. So family members may have a much more homogenous perspective than would be the case for a business that isn't family run, and so you have people bringing their various views, to bear on a particular issue or problem. And so all of these things can potentially retard the success of a business, and they would cause non-family members to potentially think twice or more about joining a family firm. So that's another challenge that I think has to be dealt with. And by the way, the family may have made a conscious decision that it is more important to take care of the family than to, for example, maximize the financial potential of the firm. So I think that if a business like that is looking to recruit non-family members, that has to be explained up front, right? And so that people know, the non-family members know going in where the limitations are, and presumably they will self-select. So non-family member potential employees who desire maximizing economic potential over all things, so then that's not the right situation for them. But there are other non-family members who will be perfectly fine with that. Their life isn't about maximizing, squeezing every last dollar out of a business. They're looking for something else. They're looking perhaps to be part of a family environment, so that although they're not literally a family member, they want to be part of a business that is as concerned about the people who work there as they are about doing well economically. Okay, and as long as the non-family member feels like they will be treated well, maybe that's all that's important to them. So that's another issue. Okay, number 5, emotional decision making over strategic thinking. So, sometimes, as I was saying just a moment ago, businesses will make decisions based on what's best for the family, as opposed to what might maximize the economic potential of the business, maybe out of a sense of financial loyalty or emotional attachment. So I'll give you an example of this from corporate America. So when Walt Disney died in 1966, I believe it was, his brother Roy was still alive. He was still a part of the business, but Walt Disney's son-in-law, I'm going up on his name, Miller. I believe it was, I want to say Dan Miller. Anyway, Miller. He came in as what we would call CEO of Walt Disney Productions, and he basically ran Walt Disney Productions by always asking, what would Walt do? Okay. This is like, it redounds like, Christians say, what would Jesus do? Right. So not that Walt Disney was, a deity, but what would Walt do? So the emotional attachment that Miller had to his father-in-law and to the Disney family really ended up stymieing the growth of Walt Disney Productions to the point where the company in many ways lost its way as it headed into the 70s. Okay, and it's what led to the takeover of Walt Disney Productions and the creation of what is now called the Walt Disney Company. Now, when that happened, Miller was pushed out, and non-family members really took over running the company. So by then, Roy Disney, Walt's brother, had died. His son was kind of involved, and he did stay involved with the Walt Disney Company in its new form, but not with anything like the amount of control over its destiny that Walt Disney and Roy Disney had, or that Miller had. So the kind of emotional decision making that Walt Disney's son-in-law did really had a significantly negative impact on that company. And it is one of the challenges of a family-owned business. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Walt Disney Productions, it was a publicly traded company. Yes, it was. But the family had the Disney family had a great deal of control over the company, despite it being publicly traded. And so, looking at a closely held business, i.e., that is a business that is not publicly traded, all the more so because there weren't there typically would not be a board of directors, or I should say an independent board of directors. There wouldn't be outside shareholders who can sort of hold the family members' feet to the fire when it came to the overall running of the business. So this emotional decision making over strategic thinking can have a deleterious impact on a family owned and run business. And it's something that needs to be balanced. I don't want to say it's something that needs to be avoided, because I don't think it's possible to avoid it 100%. But it needs to be carefully and periodically examined. So for example, if a family run business has a poor performing member of the firm who's a family member, maybe that person does need to be fired. Now, that's a tough thing for a family to do, especially if that family values familial loyalty, right? But keeping on an employee who is not performing properly, it may not just be not maximizing the economic potential of the business, but it can really be detracting from the long-term viability of the business, depending on what position that family member holds, right? So there needs to be a proper balance between strategic thinking and emotional decision making. Now, before I leave this issue, I do want to say that while we might like to think that non-family owned and run businesses don't engage in emotional decision making, clearly that is not the case. Human beings are inherently emotional, and emotions oftentimes will impact the decisions we make, whether they're business decisions or personal decisions. So it's not that non-family businesses don't face this issue. It's just it's not as big a problem, because there aren't familial ties within the business. And so if one particular person is recommending a course of action that seems to be overly emotionally laden, the other people who are involved in making that decision have the ability essentially to say, hey, I don't think that's the right direction for us to go. I don't think that it will maximize the potential of the business, et cetera, et cetera. And although the person suggesting the more emotionally fraught course of action might get their feelings hurt, somewhat. Well, okay, but at that point, that's kind of their problem, right? Whereas that's a more difficult thing to say when family members are involved, because there are the familial relationships to maintain. Okay, so number 5, emotional decision making over strategic thinking. Number 6, communications breakdowns and conflict. So sometimes, if the family is going through a rough patch in their family lives, there might be a desire to put off or postpone or completely avoid certain important business conversations or decisions, right? Now, this is different than an emotional decision making. This is where the decisions are being, like, say, postponed or just avoided altogether. And so, again, this can have a materially negative impact on the business, and this sort of breakdown in communication really can become, I should say, almost an existential issue for that business. Now, it's can be very difficult to handle, because if they're, for example, let's say the business is owned by a husband and wife and they're getting a divorce. And so the acrimony over the divorce colors everything that's happening in the business. And if you've ever gone through a divorce, you know that sometimes you hit moments of divorce fatigue where you just feel like you just can't deal with the issues right now. Now imagine feeling that, but you're running a business with your, soon to be ex-spouse, and there are important business decisions that need to be considered and made. But every time you talk about them, acrimonious decisions or acrimonious events from the marriage are brought into the mix. And so at some point, you just kind of throw your hands up and say, I'm just not going to talk about these things anymore, right? Well, now you've got a communication breakdown, and now the business is challenged to function really at all. And so these can be the most difficult aspects of a family owned and run business with which to deal, because there doesn't seem to be a way to resolve them. And again, this is a time when potentially bringing in a neutral third party who can mediate some of these things, who can set ground rules for business meetings and business communications, and can be there so that if one of the spouses starts saying something egregious that's not relevant to the topic under discussion, the third party can say, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you here. That's off topic. If we need to take a break for 5 minutes for people to relax for that time and then come back refocused on the issues at hand, we'll do that. If we don't need to do that time, then let's get back to the focused discussion that needs to be made. Now, one spouse is not going to be, generally speaking, going to be able to say something like that successfully to the other one. It will take that neutral third party to be able to enforce the ground rules. By the way, even worse, expecting a child to do that between his parents, putting that child, and I'm talking about an adult child, of course, but even putting an adult child into that role could be a very bad situation, and could be as likely to draw the child into the conflict, the family conflict, the divorce, in a negative way as it is to facilitate working through these communications breakdowns. So I think all of these things need to be considered, and they need to be worked through. I think we all want to believe that we're mature people, we're sensible people, and hopefully most, if not all of us are. But by the same token, we get tired, we get aggravated, uh, and sometimes we lose our tempers. And in a business context, that of course is not appropriate, but it is the reality of human existence. And so we may need to set up structures within the business to make sure that the communications and the decisions that need to be made are made, and are not made subject to this communication breakdown or the avoidance of decision making because of not an outside, but because of a family problem that has arisen. Okay, so that's number 6, communication breakdown and conflict avoidance. Number 7, pressure to employ unprepared or uninterested family members. So I've alluded to this previously, where I talked about the unequal abilities, knowledge, experience of family members, and how that can impact compensation, or the perception of compensation among family members and non-family members. All the more so if a family member is invited into the business before that family member was perceived to be able to handle the position that the family member is given, or a family member who's just not interested in being part of the business is brought in essentially against his will. So if you've heard of a company called News Corp, the name of that company is not as well known as the businesses it either owned or used to own. So News Corp owns, among other things, the Wall Street Journal, right? The newspaper here in the United States with the highest circulation. It used to own 20th Century Fox Studios. It sold it, I think, a year or two ago to Disney. It owns Fox News and Fox Sports. The original owner of News Corp, oh gosh, I'm going up on his name now. I'm gonna have to look it up here real quickly. Rupert Murdoch. Sorry, I had to look up his name. So Rupert Murdoch, who founded and ran News Corp for for decades, right? At one point, he decided to bring his son into the company, and there was consternation over that decision, and there were some non-family member executives who left the company because they felt that the son was not prepared to take over the role that Rupert Murdoch gave him, and so they felt slighted on the one hand, and they felt that company performance was being sacrificed on the altar of familial loyalty, if you will. And they didn't like that. And now there was also some discussions about, did he really want to be part of the family business, right? And by the way, this is common in the media business, where what used to be called the entertainment business here in Los Angeles. You see the same thing in Paramount, where Shari Redstone was brought into the company by Sumner Redstone, who they had a company called National Amusements that bought Paramount Studios. And you saw it even earlier, where Louis B. Mayer brought in people to work at MGM because it was his son-in-law or this and that. So these kinds of family dynamics have played out in the sort of corporate side of the entertainment business, for decades and decades and decades. Okay. And there needs to therefore be a realistic assessment of the abilities of a family member who is being brought into a company, whether it's a huge, media conglomerate or whether it's a small family run business, especially if there are non-family members working there, and especially if the business is partly owned by non-family members. They may not have a controlling interest, but if they have an ownership interest, that will be affected by an unprepared, or for that matter, an uninterested family member being brought into the business. And again, it may be something that requires a neutral third party sort of vetting it. The uninterested family member may feel very guilty and reluctant to express a lack of interest in the family business, and it might be something they just would not say to their, let's say, their parents, if it was parents trying to bring them in. Whereas they might be more willing to talk to a non-family, a neutral third party who's brought in specifically to work on some of these decisions and give advice on some of these decisions. And it can be easier for, to use the example of parents, it could be easier for the parents to hear from a third party, a neutral third party consultant. My recommendation is you don't bring your, daughter into the business. My assessment is that she's really torn between loyalty to you as her parents and her interest in other professional endeavors. And I think it would be detrimental to your familial and personal relationships to insist she come on board. I think you'd be better advised, let her explore other professional endeavors and see where that leads her. Maybe down the road, she'll conclude that she does want to become part of the family business. Okay. Now, and maybe that may be easier for the parents to hear coming from a third party. On the other hand, hopefully, or maybe the daughter, and I'm using a daughter in this case, has the ability to lovingly explain this to her parents in a way that they will hear it, right? So, nonetheless, this is another issue that needs to be dealt with appropriately, so that the business can continue to operate properly. Okay, and then finally, number 8, exit strategy limitations and liquidity constraints. So, oftentimes, when it's a family-owned business, there are limited options when owners want to exit. Because, for example, selling to non-family members could dilute the family ownership of the business, and it could go from being a majority family-owned business to a non-majority family-owned business, right? And that can be problematic for future generations. So, if there are multiple family member owners of a business and one of them wants out, their only option may be to sell their share to the other family members, right? And that may mean that it will be difficult for that person to realize the full value of their ownership, and that can cause conflict as well, right? So imagine working in a business, a family-run business for 20 years, 30 years, right? And you want to retire now, the other family members don't. You know, all of your wealth or most of your wealth is concentrated in your ownership of the business. You now want access to that in order to fund your retirement. What are you going to do? How is that going to be handled? So, just as in any other type of business that has co-owners and that is closely held, meaning it's not publicly traded, so there needs to be a proper succession plan put in place that specifies how owners can essentially exit a business, what will happen, to whom they can sell, how will the terms of that sale be determined. All of that needs to be worked out. And best case, worked out long before anybody wants to exit the business. At the point where someone wants to exit the business and these issues haven't been resolved, so it will almost for sure become more likely to work them out, because now there is pressure for it to be worked out one way or the other. And when people are under pressure, they oftentimes don't think as clearly as they would when there isn't that kind of pressure. Okay. And so their objectivity could get clouded, and then that can lead to conflict, and down the road you go. So for example, in a proper succession plan, there should be a mechanism for valuing the business. And that mechanism probably shouldn't be, what mom and dad think it's worth, right? There needs to be a third party valuation of the business, and there needs to be an appropriate way of paying for that third party analysis. Okay. Now, maybe if someone is exiting the business, then they have to pay for that analysis. They're the one that wants to leave. And so that they're the one creating the necessity for the valuation of the business. And so it wouldn't be right to force the other business owners to pay for that valuation, because they're not leaving. They don't want to leave. And if they had their druthers, they would still have the family member a part of it, but that family member wants to exit. That could be one way of deciding just that one little issue in the succession plan. Okay. But you may decide as a measure of, family harmony, that the family members or the business itself will pay for the valuation. Everybody will, essentially all the owners will share in that cost, is what it really comes down to. And that's the better way to go. So all of these issues, even down to the details, should be worked out in a proper succession plan, so that at the time somebody wants to liquidate their ownership or exit the business, there is a way that it can be done, and it can be accomplished with the least amount of pressure on familial relationships, in a way that gives the business the best opportunity to continue operating as free from interference. Interference is not exactly the right word, but free from the downside of an owner leaving. So that's the final issue I wanted to raise on the challenges of family owned and run business: exit strategy limitations and liquidity constraints. So if you are in a family owned business, or considering being in a family owned business, I encourage you to think about these issues, to deal with them up front. If you're starting a family run business, that's the best time to deal with all of these, to put mechanisms in place that can avoid, or at least shortcut, what could be the types of conflicts that arise out of these challenges. And so that way, from the get-go, you're both honoring the familial relationships while also setting the business on as firm a foundation as you possibly can. So I thank you very much for joining me today, especially my live viewers. Always a treat to know you're watching. If you have questions, comments, criticisms, links to social media will be in the show notes. I invite them, as always. If you know of someone who you think might benefit from watching or listening to this show, please tell them about it. I would really appreciate having the opportunity to earn them as a viewer, listener, or as a subscriber to my YouTube channel. And that only leaves me to thank you again for joining me. Wishing you a wonderful rest of the day and week. This is my last broadcast for this week, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.